Occasionally through this series, we come across cars, especially racing ones in particular, that look almost like the kind of thing that could have popped up in, for instance, Gran Turismo 4 and blown our minds as kids when we first saw them. For me, that happened with stuff like the Chaparral 2J, which prior to playing the game, because I was so young, I'd never heard of before. This to me looks like that exact kind of car that could have just randomly popped up in a Gran Turismo game and encouraged a whole new generation of kids and even adults who hadn't heard of it before to like a certain more oddball, more obscure vehicle. This, I think, is a perfect example of that, and it's the kind of car which I'm actually sort of surprised hasn't been featured in more games, but especially Gran Turismo, and there's a very specific reason for that, and that is polyphony. Because of course Gran Turismo is a Japanese game designed and produced by a predominantly, if not entirely, Japanese team. This car is hugely important to Japan's motorsport history because in the early 60s, Japan was only starting to get into the motorsport scene, but most of the stuff that they started to do tend to be more saloon type racing. Because at the time, Japan was producing mostly high-volume, low-cost, everyday cars. Saloons, if you will, as they were called back then. Because saloon back then is not what it meant now. Nowadays, that's like a four-door car, whereas back then a saloon could even mean a two-door vehicle, but generally it was like a boxy, daily driver kind of thing. Think Nissan Bluebird or Renault 4, that kind of stuff. Now, this company, called Hino, a Japanese brand, predominantly produce vehicles like that. They even produced their version of the Renault 4 under license from Renault themselves, and some of those were used in racing. Some of which were even used by a certain Peter Brock. The same Peter Brock, an American, who designed the Cobra, the Shelby GT350 Mustang, and my personal favourite classic car design of all time, the Daytona Cobra. That probably isn't too surprising once you look at, in particular, the back end of this car, because he designed this one as well. And once you know that, you can kind of see his flair, especially at the back. It has that very Daytona Cobra-esque shape to it, almost like a Daytona Cobra meets a little bit of Lamborghini Miura and maybe a bit of really early 60s Ferrari F40 in the form of that rear wing. In the form of the rear wing in particular, though, this car really was ahead of its time. Because in the 60s, even up until when this car was built in 1967, very few race cars used and took seriously the concept of having a rear wing. Now, Japan was not doing that much in the racing world in terms of purpose-built prototype machines, so this car was kind of important for the time, you could say, and although it had radical looks, it didn't really have radical power or even radical straight-line performance. It was powered by a 1.3-litre straight-four engine, very high revving, over 9,000 RPM, putting out about 110 horsepower, which by today's standards doesn't sound like a huge amount. That's like a Fiat Panda 100 HP level these days, which is a 10 grand hot hatch. But back then, and even a good 2 decades onward, that's a very impressive amount of power for such a small classic engine to be putting out. Unfortunately, that in part, some other things as well, caused the car to not exactly be the most reliable thing around. It would eat camshafts, its brakes failed as well, it even blew entire engines in its run in SCCA racing. But it was a good idea. Fundamentally it had some issues, but it was a good race car. Unfortunately though, there's a reason why it's in this series, and it's not just that it was forgotten. Predominantly, it was plagued by issues, and one of the dumbest issues was what prevented it from actually racing in the entire purpose-built series that it was intended for in the first place. And that was Japanese sports car racing, because the rules dictated, or at least some, let's just say, iffy interpretations of the rules by those who were checking out the car before the race began, said that the car could not race, because it was, and I quote, too low to the ground. They really turned up the BS faucet to the max for that ruling. What a ridiculous idea that a race car could be too low to the ground, but for that reason, it couldn't race. And it really was as simple as that. And such a shame that a car that was still so important to Japanese motorsport and could have been even more so were it actually allowed to race, reliability or otherwise, they could have improved that over time. It just never had that chance. Now, thankfully, there is a golden lining, if you will, on this slightly somber story of the car's history, because I said that it did indeed have the chance to race, but more so in SCCA class racing, where it actually did really well. In fact, in its category, it had more than 25 first place finishes, more than 12 second place finishes, and in the course of a 4-year racing history in the SCCA, it never placed lower than 5th. That's very impressive for a car with such a tiny engine, such a small amount of power, which was originally entirely denied its birthright, if you will, of being this iconic forefront of Japanese motorsport at the time. It kind of is a phoenix story to some degree. It went into the ashes in its kind of homegrown racing, but then rose to prominence in other forms. But in a similar way to other companies like Mosler, for instance, despite their great success, they're still not exactly a household name. And that's funny when that happens, because it deserves to be. And this car, I think, definitely does. It looks stunning, certainly is a timeless design. It's a collector's piece, that's for sure, and it is currently owned by a collector in America. It changed hands a few times. Peter Brock himself actually purchased it at one point, then sold it on to a Japanese collector. So the car certainly has appreciation by those who know of it, who know of its history, and who appreciate it. But it has an interesting history, for sure. There's certainly more that you can look into if you decide to research it for yourself. So if you are the kind of person who loves the meaty backstory that we get into in this kind of episode of this series, then I would urge you to Google this car and read up about it, because there's tons of interesting information from multiple sources out there about its history, about the modifications and changes that it underwent. For instance, the engine issues, having engine supplier issues, trying to build the engine to actually cope with that kind of power and revs and performance. But there's plenty out there to look up if you are interested. And if there was ever a car that deserves looking into, I think it's this one. It's an amazing little hero of a car as far as Japanese companies go, and at least it had some chance to shine, which is more than you can say for many of the other cars that we've talked about. And finally, speaking to its original purpose of racing and representing Japan, in effect, in the motorsport scene, it was ironically a Japanese company that kind of stopped that from happening, because Toyota actually purchased the Hino brand and then told them not to race this car again. They forbade them from racing in Le Mans because that was the ultimate goal of the vehicle, and Toyota simply did not want the rivalry from a brand that they owned. Understandable from a business point of view, but just like when Mercedes encouraged Chrysler, or even requested Chrysler, to not produce the ME412 because it would have overshadowed even the SLR McLaren at the time, it's a shame when that happens. Understandable, as I said, from a business point of view, but still a shame nonetheless, because it strips away these opportunities for truly remarkable cars, and this was one of those. At least, though, as I said, it did have that chance to race, albeit under different circumstances, different rule books, and in different parts of the world. But overall, very cool classic, certainly an undervalued and underappreciated one, and what a cool little car from a guy who's far better known for his other creations, like the Cobra, the Daytona Cobra, and the GT350. But overall, that's it for this installment. Of course, if you are new to this series, we've done a ton of really interesting cars, so you can click here on screen to see those. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.